Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into something really significant and pretty fascinating. A powerful trio of global fixes. We're talking climate change, human migration, and the global economy. Now, you might think of these as separate, huge challenges, but our mission today is to really unpack how deeply intertwined these three things are, like gears in a giant global machine. Each one pushes and pulls the others. This whole exploration is inspired by a really interesting discussion between a student and an expert focused on these exact connections. So we'll explore how these massive forces shape our world and maybe most importantly, what it all means for you, the listener, and well, for all of our futures. Okay, so let's kick things off maybe with the most direct link, how a changing climate literally shifts where people can actually live. We hear a lot about sea level rise, obviously. But what are some other ways climate change is forcing people out of their homes?
Yeah, it's a really profound impact, and it happens in many ways. Of course, the IPCC, that's the UN's main scientific body on climate change, they project millions in low-lying coastal areas will likely need to move by 2050. That's huge. But it's not just the coasts. We're also seeing, more frequent and intense droughts. Desertification is spreading faster in some areas. And then you have these extreme weather events, think really long heat waves or massive storms. These aren't just minor problems. They can make whole regions basically unlivable. They strip away livelihoods, make farming impossible, and just make daily life unsustainable. And when people are forced to leave because of these environmental issues, we often call them climate migrants. It's actually an important point to clarify because you sometimes hear climate refugees now.
Yeah.
But legally, under international law, a refugee is someone fleeing persecution. The thing is, our legal systems haven't really caught up with this reality of climate displacement. And that creates some really complex challenges for policy and for providing aid.
That's a critical distinction. Right, so this isn't people just deciding they want a change of scenery. It's often a desperate move, completely involuntary. So what makes that kind of migration so different in terms of the social and economic ripples compared to, say, someone who chooses to move for a better job?
Exactly. That involuntary nature is absolutely key. Someone moving voluntarily, they often have some resources, right? Maybe family or friends already there, maybe even a job offer. Climate migrants, though, they frequently arrive suddenly, often in large numbers, and typically with very few resources, very little support waiting for them. This difference puts immediate and sometimes quite significant pressure on the communities and countries they arrive in. It strains everything from housing to schools to healthcare.
Right. Speaking of that strain, let's pivot a bit to the economic side of migration. How do host countries actually manage these sudden, sometimes large influxes? We often hear the concerns about resources being stretched thin, but what's the bigger economic picture look like?
Well, initially, yes, there can definitely be a strain. No doubt about that. Host countries might feel immediate pressure on, say, their housing stock, existing roads and transport, healthcare services, schools. That's a very real challenge. But it's really not the whole story, not by a long shot. Migration can also bring pretty substantial economic benefits over time. New arrivals can fill labor shortages. That's something many developed countries with aging populations are actually grappling with. They bring new skills, new perspectives, contribute to cultural diversity, and they can genuinely spur innovation and entrepreneurship in the economy. Just think back, for example, to the U.S. in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Those waves of immigrants were absolutely vital in building industries, expanding railways, growing cities. That basic principle hasn't really changed. Now, climate-driven migration adds new layers of complexity, sure, the scale, the speed, the lack of resources sometimes. But the potential for positive economic contribution is still there. It's profound.
That makes sense. It's a balance. But what about the other side of the coin? The countries people are leaving. What happens economically there when a chunk of the population, often younger people, departs? Is it always just a loss for them?
That's where it gets quite mixed, actually, almost paradoxical sometimes.
Yeah.
On one hand, losing people, especially working-age adults, can shrink the local workforce.
Yeah.
It can slow down economic activity, especially in certain sectors. That's undeniable. But on the other hand, migration very often leads to remittances. That's the money migrants send back home to their families.
Right, the money sent back.
Exactly. And in some countries, these remittances are huge. They make up a really significant slice of the national GDP. Sometimes they're a critical economic lifeline for families and even the national economy. So it's this dynamic balance you see. Potential loss of human capital locally, but potentially significant gains in foreign currency coming in and improved stability for households back home.
Yeah.
What that balance looks like in the end really depends on things like The skills of the people leaving, the state of the economy they left, and definitely the policies of the countries they moved to.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. We've touched on climate change pushing migration and migration impacting economies. But how does the global economy itself kind of sit in the middle, driving both climate change and migration pressures?
Yeah, the global economy is a massive driver here, influencing both in really fundamental ways. Directly, for one thing, industrialized economies are, historically and currently, the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. That's the core of climate change. At the same time, global demand for specific resources, think fossil fuels, timber for furniture or building, agricultural products like soy or beef. This demand can accelerate environmental damage in vulnerable regions. Often, these regions are far removed from where the final product is consumed. This is where we get into something called telecoupling.
Telecoupling.
Yeah, it basically means human and environmental systems being tightly linked across really long distances. Let me give you a concrete example. Think about the demand for cheap beef in, say, Europe or North America. That demand can directly drive deforestation in places like the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. That deforestation then messes with local rainfall, contributes to global climate change through carbon release and loss of carbon sinks, and it can end up displacing the rural farmers or indigenous communities who depended on that forest.
Wow, so my burger choice could literally connect to someone losing their home halfway across the world.
It's a stark example, but yes, the connections can be that direct. It links your consumption choices to distant environmental and social impacts. And there's another angle, too. A country's economic strength heavily influences its capacity to deal with climate change impacts. Wealthier economies can invest in adaptation, building seawalls, developing drought-resistant crops, improving water management, transitioning to renewable energy. Poorer countries often just don't have the resources for those big investments. This makes them much more vulnerable to climate shocks, which in turn ramps up the pressure for people to migrate. It closes the loop.
So it sounds like this really challenging feedback loop then. Vulnerable countries get hit by climate change, people migrate. That migration strains their already fragile economies, making it even harder for them to adapt to future climate impacts. Is that about right? So what does this actually mean for us? What's maybe a less obvious consequence of this cycle just repeating?
That's exactly the loop. It's complex and deeply challenging. And one thing that's maybe overlooked sometimes is how this feedback loop can quietly make global inequalities even worse.
Yeah.
It makes it incredibly hard for the most vulnerable nations to break out of that cycle and catch up, even when there's international aid involved. So breaking this cycle, it requires a huge effort. We're talking serious international cooperation, major targeted investment, and fundamentally a shift towards more sustainable economic models globally. Now, we do have some real-world examples where cooperation is happening, even if they're not perfect solutions yet. Take the Pacific Islands Forum, for instance. Many Pacific Island nations are facing, existential threats from sea level rise.
Right. Some are incredibly vulnerable.
Extremely. So they've been working together and partnering with larger neighbors like Australia and New Zealand. They're trying to develop planned migration pathways, provide economic support, and fund climate adaptation projects on the ground. It's a working model. It shows that collaboration is possible, even when the challenges are immense. But let's be realistic, the hurdles to scaling this up globally are significant. Migration itself is often a really politically sensitive topic in many countries.
Certainly.
And meaningful climate action. It often involves substantial upfront costs. Plus, some governments, frankly, tend to prioritize short-term economic gains over long-term environmental sustainability. And that definitely complicates the kind of coordinated global effort that's needed.
So ultimately, it feels like it comes back to a basic level of awareness, of understanding these connections. Even for us, for you listening, just knowing how these pieces fit together changes how you see these huge global problems, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Education, awareness, they're incredibly powerful tools. When people, whether they're policymakers making decisions or just citizens understanding the world, when they can really see and grasp these intricate links between climate, migration, and the economy, it fundamentally shifts the perspective. It helps everyone understand the bigger picture. And hopefully that understanding inspires more effective, more integrated solutions. It helps us move beyond just reacting to symptoms and start addressing the root causes.
This has been really illuminating, pulling together these threads in the climate migration economy triangle. It just hammers home how interconnected these global challenges are and really how interconnected our whole world is now.
Exactly. And if you take that one step further, it becomes crystal clear that no single country, no single entity can possibly solve these challenges alone. The more connected our understanding becomes, the better chance we have of developing solutions that are actually integrated